From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome everybody, Yamagaraninda. I'm Kathy Craigie. Welcome to the First Nations Australia Writers Network panel. We are absolutely honoured and delighted to be here to talk to you today and tell you a little bit about who we are, about our cultures, and also about our writing, which is, I guess, a natural extension of the oral storytelling that our peoples had. And our writers today, we have Bruce Pascoe, who he doesn't seem to leave the seat, Bruce. Bruce Pascoe, Tony Birch, and our youngest writer that's with us today, Ellen van Neerven. We might start off, this session is, it's sort of open slather, this session really. What's the session called? Isn't that terrible?
Stories from Down Under?
Well, that's it, it's open. So we've been telling you stories from Down Under in the last two sessions, but we might start straight away. Now, Ellen, the other two have already been up, so we might start with you and get you to tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm a Mulunjali woman from the east coast of Australia. Mulunjali people, we belong to the Yugambeh Bundjalung language, and our family group are wedge-tailed eagle people. That's the bird that we identify with, and we call wedge-tailed eagle Mibbin. So when we see a Mibbin fly over us, that's a good sign, that's a good omen, and we believe that the eagles will protect us while we're on our country. I grew up in Brisbane, which is the third largest city in Australia, and grew up travelling from the city and back to our ancestral country. I started writing through, it was a journey that happened because it's all because my mum got a job in the library. My mum got a job in the library when my brother and I were young and too young to be left at home, and we would have to sit in the library while Mum worked, and there was nothing to do. We were outdoor kids, but we had to make do with the strange things that were all around us, and found books that way, found the stories that got me through childhood and high school years, and but it wasn't till I was in my 20s at university that I read the first book by an Aboriginal writer. The schooling that I had was a whitewash. It was very one-sided, so of course the history, but also the literature as well. So I read works by, what we call, the elders of our literature, from Ujuru Nunakul, Uncle Lionel Fogarty. It was people like them they were activists, but also writers, and so I really got to learn a lot through reading their works, and it made me feel like myself as an Aboriginal person I could also write. And so my book, Heat and Light, which came out last year, it's told mainly through a young perspective, being a young person myself. And these young people are learning about their family, about their culture, about the colonial scars on the land, and people that people are living with, and they're really making their way through all different sorts of circumstances. And a big part of my book is about a family, and I feel like the way I explain it is it's a family tree in a book. You get to find 3 or 4 generations of one family through this continuing story, and it's told through different perspectives of each family member, because, I feel like, if you're, at a family gathering, that we all will tell a story a different way, Sometimes, it can be quite comical, So what's left out and what's put in, and so I wanted to let all of the family members have their say in this book. And later on, or maybe now, depending on what you'd like,
We're going to get you to read
I
a
will
little
read
bit further.
from,
later, yeah?
Yeah, from one of the young characters in the story.
I just wanted to introduce the other two. I know they've been up on stage before, but I'm not quite sure how much the audience has changed. So we'll start.
Tony, my name's.
I was just going to call you Bruce, and that's Tony. But we'll start with Tony. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background. I know we've done it before, but just to...
I'll tell something different. I'll make something up. So anyone... so my name's Bruce Pascoe.
And he has been mistaken for some film star since you've been here, haven't you?
Harvey Keitel. In The Bad Lieutenant. Probably what I would say, which is Ellen just talked about what she is interested in writing about, and the supposed theme of this is, I did mention before, I grew up in the inner city of Melbourne, and one of the great volunteers was asking me before about, is it much smaller and quieter than Washington? Well, in fact, no, Melbourne's a bigger city and much noisier than Washington. So I come from a city of about 4.5 million people, but grew up in a very dense inner city area, which would be similar to many inner cities in North America until, like us, you experienced gentrification in the 1970s and 80s. And being an Aboriginal kid in the inner city, I was very fortunate that someone mentioned the word multicultural before. I grew up Catholic, so I went to school where all my friends were Italian. When I went to high school, I went to a school in Richmond, which was mainly Greek migrant from the 60s and 70s, so all my mates were Greek. So I was very lucky. And then I lived for about 20 years in Brunswick, which has a huge Middle Eastern community. So one of the things about growing up in Melbourne as an Aboriginal person is you have great opportunity to genuinely mix with kids outside the dominant Anglo culture. A great friend of mine, a poet, he said that anyone who grew up in inner Melbourne after the war till the 70s has the same emotional vibration, so that there's a street language that you grew up that's in common. And one of the things that was talked about earlier, Janine talked about sort of the two worlds. What happened in Melbourne is a little different in the sense the two worlds divided between home. So your home might be Aboriginal, Greek, Italian, but the street belonged to all of those kids. So I'm very lucky to have grown up in a generation who are now, sort of mid-40s to mid-50s, who had that great common experience in the 60s. So I'm very, very fortunate. And the only thing I'd say that leads to is that most of my work is about failures, about people who are outsiders who don't succeed. And I'm very much drawn to people who exist on the margins of mainstream society. My latest book and some of the stories in this book are about homeless people, people who are disenfranchised from family, people who make really bad decisions in life and try to get back their life and usually fail. And I actually think coming from a country like Australia, which has this incredibly shallow mythology about who we are and what we are, and we beat more drums than a brass band in Australia about we're the greatest country in the world, and we are a country which has an enormous, not only dark history, which has a complex history, which in fact is more interesting. So I actually think failure is more interesting than a fiction of success. So that's what I write about.
Yeah, and one of the things we talked about earlier in the other two panels, we talked about the hidden history and the secret history in Australia that you don't always get, that you're not taught in schools, but it's the history of Aboriginal people and not just through contact period but also before. Bruce, I know you've introduced yourself, you were just on the last panel, but just quickly, and then I want to come to your book and come back. So could you just tell us who you are? I know your name's really Tony, but...
And you're better looking than you think you are.
My dogs think I'm really good looking.
My dog sleeps with me. So. True story.
Too much information. My family hid from their identity, so in order to find some branches of our family, I had to go and talk to old people from those language groups, trying to find out what had happened to the family, where they were now, that sort of thing. And I was a university graduate by that stage, and the people that I went to thought I was a complete idiot because I had gone to school, I'd gone to secondary school, I'd gone to university, I'd studied history, I eventually taught history and English, and I believed the history that my country had written about Australia. So when I started asking these ridiculous questions of my elders, they sometimes refused to talk to me, they refused to look at me. And gradually they encouraged me to look more deeply at the history. They provoked me into looking more closely at the history, and I was ashamed. You know, I was a university graduate, you know, I thought of myself as an intellect, and I realised that I had swallowed the thimble and pea, which is an old-fashioned game. We say it in Australia, swallow the thimble and pea, meaning you would believe anything. And I did. So I had to refurbish my mind, and in doing so, I realised that there were no books that could explain the history that those old people were talking about. The official Australian history had Aboriginal people doing nothing. When Europeans arrived, they didn't fight for their land, which is a complete lie. They then walked meekly into the missions and began taking rations. But in fact, there was a completely different story to that. And so as a fiction writer, I was trying to tell that story through fiction, but realised eventually that I would have to write histories. If someone mentioned last night in that wonderful building, the Library of Congress building, that they only wrote histories that they thought they would like to read. And so I was trying to write histories that I thought I could read with some confidence that it would be the correct history of the country.
The panel today is I mean, this one this afternoon is quite open. It's about stories from down under, but all these stories and just their own personal introductions, you can see there's a big diversity in Aboriginal people. It's not just the diversity in our languages and cultural practices across the country, although we have lots of common areas. There's lots of, stereotypical thoughts about Aboriginal people, that we all look a certain way, and that's never been the truth. That we all have the same backgrounds, that's never been a truth, and I think today you've been introduced to 6 writers who all come from very different backgrounds. So I'm going to come back to you, Ellen, because your story, Heat and Light, is about that family. It has family journeys through it, and you just told us a little bit about your own family and about reading, coming to Aboriginal literature later in life. Tell us a little bit about Heat and Light.
Sure. So Heat and Light, I explained a little bit earlier. The family in Heat and Light are called the Cressinger family, and the 2 main characters are 2 sisters, Marie and Pearl, and Marie, her and her sister are very, even though they're very close in age, they're very different, and their father, Zani, he was, when the settlers came, they decided that he would be king of the people, his people and gave him a breastplate. This echoes my own family story. I'm a descendant of Bill and Billen, who was when the Europeans came, it was easier to choose someone to be a spokesperson to communicate with, and to have what they called kings. But that's not how traditional structure worked. But so he was made to wear a breastplate around his neck, and so this and the reason why I write about this is because there are hundreds of descendants of Bill and Billen today. I'm just one of them, and we're very, very diverse. We all have our own different stories, and so in the Cressinger family you see a whole range of characters and different lives and how they intersect, and this is really shown through these two sisters who are very different. Pearl actually, she disappears. There's a huge chunk of her life missing that now the younger generations are trying to figure out.
What happened to her?
Yeah,
or where she was.
Yeah.
Most of our stories are based around family or based around our culture. I mean, there are very few Aboriginal artists of any sort, including visual and music, that we don't write or in some way try to tell a story from our own cultures. I'm going to come back to Tony and have a little talk about The Promise. What is The Promise about?
The Promise is, like all of my books, always has a reference to Bruce Springsteen. So,
and here I was talking about it. That's the Aboriginal Bruce Springsteen.
I always have a Springsteen reference in all of my books. And it might seem like, where's the connection? But one of the great influences in Aboriginal communities is music. And even though we have, again, great traditions of forms of music as storytelling, communication, very strong contemporary music, one of the greatest influences of music in Australia, in Aboriginal communities Australia-wide, is country and western music. And one of the stories in this book is called The Ghost of Hank Williams, and I suppose in a way the story epitomises the book as an ensemble of short stories, is that this book is about me wanting to say these are people who either are estranged from community because of their own choice, or we've forced these people to the margins because they don't fit the image that we want to convey to ourselves or to the world as a sort of supposed democratic equal society. One of the great myths, again, of Australia is the notion of egalitarianism, which is a complete and utter myth. We've talked about, by the way, this morning, in a very contemporary and current context, our absolute disgust and shame of being Australians abroad when our government treats refugees and asylum seekers in a violent and reprehensible way in the name of doing violence on Aboriginal country that we're completely opposed to. So all of my work tries to take people in those situations of marginality and not try to redeem them, but to try and give them full value. One of the things I'm interested in is alcohol. Alcohol, not personally. I don't drink alcohol at all. This is not a whiskey throat. Alcohol is something that can be quite devastating in all Australian communities. It's not an Aboriginal problem. Statistically, more white Australians drink and abuse alcohol than Aboriginal people. But at the same time, I actually think there's a way of looking at alcohol and how people have partaken in it in a way that accepts them for what they are. I'll just read one page of my work and go on, but this is two characters, two Aboriginal men who drink, and one of them is a busker. His name in the story is Curtis, but there is a very well-known Aboriginal busker in Melbourne called Black Elvis, and you may not know it or not, but he is Elvis Presley, and he will tell you that Elvis inhabits his body as an Aboriginal country and western singer in Melbourne, and don't ever doubt him. Okay. I met up with Curtis the next day and sat with him under a tree sharing a bottle. I'd already decided it would be best not to spoil a nice afternoon with a tale of woe from my doctor. And I didn't want to interrupt the story he was telling about the night his second wife ran off on him and he got down on his hands and knees in the kitchen and prayed to his long dead mother to help him get the love of his life back. I had my eyes closed and I heard this roaring wind, and she came down the chimney over the wood stove there in the kitchen. She slapped me hard across the face and told me I didn't deserve a woman, good or evil. My own mother used those very words. He took a swig from the bottle, wiped it on his sleeve and passed it to me. I held it to my hand and thought long and hard about a drink, about taking one. How long had your mother been dead by then? I asked him. A good 20 years, he said, maybe 30. How'd she look after being dead all that time? Just as I expected, my mother looked like an angel. Curse and me drank away the afternoon and into the night, trying our best to out-bullshit each other until he passed out against the tree. I sat staring up at a big black sky until I fell asleep too. I don't remember getting to my feet or taking off anywhere, but when I woke the next morning I saw a hot sun lifting in the sky. I was lying in a paddock in the middle of nowhere. My shoes and socks and shirt were missing, and I had bruises and cuts on my arms and feet. I didn't know where I was, how I'd got there, and my pockets were as empty as a ghost coffin. I'd also taken a decent belting. I got to my feet and stumbled across the paddock, trying to stay out of the way of the thistles and thorns. I came across a road and started walking. It wasn't long before a copper came along. He pulled onto a rise on the side of the bitumen. I was in trouble, but was worn out and ready for him to put me away. But he never. He drove me to the local lockup, dug out a flannelette shirt and some shoes and socks from the lost property box, wrote me a rail pass, even gave me a $20 note from his own wallet and dropped me at the railway station. Your train should be here in around 40 minutes. It'll get you back to the city. I thanked him and I meant it. How'd you end up out here, he laughed, without a car in the middle of nowhere? I looked up at the sky and scratched my head. Buggered if I know.
Tony talked a little bit about, the situation in Australia at the moment and a government that has the slogan of turn back the boats. And for Aboriginal people, they were all boat people that came in, and but we never asked our opinion of how we feel about the situation with migrants coming in. And over the last couple of months, there's been a group in Australia, a group of Australians that are calling themselves Reclaim Australia. And they come out and they're protesting around different cities and countries, areas, and this is all about they're opposed against the Muslims coming into our area. They're opposed against basically anything. But one of the most beautiful things that I saw was they were having a rally, and there were lots of clashes between a lot of young Australians who opposed their sort of behaviour. And Melbourne, in fact, was one of the most violent protests.
We do it good in Melbourne.
It's that drinking. But one of the most beautiful, while all this was happening, this conflict was happening, there was a young Aboriginal boy that was standing with a sign, and on that, and he didn't say anything, he just stood there, and in the sign it said, "It's not yours to claim." And and then I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important for Aboriginal writers, is because we need to correct the truths and we need to tell the real story of Australia. So I'm going to come up now to, I was going to call you Santa Claus then, that white beard, it just keeps getting to me, to Bruce, because Bruce, we're talking about the diversity in Aboriginal people, and Bruce's latest book is called Dark Emu, Black Seeds, Agriculture or Accident. And, I guess we question some of the things that are around, and there's always been this notion that Aboriginal people, we didn't do anything. And the old, the argument of terra nullius was that, there wasn't anything growing. They didn't have fences, so they didn't really own it. So I want to pass it over to Bruce to talk about some of those things and what you've raised in your book about, some of the truths that haven't been told.
I've been up since 3:30. Normally my forehead is, very smooth. I look quite handsome in my normal life. I'm just having a rough day. I couldn't sleep. None of us could sleep last night. We'd had a big day, Smithsonian Institute, Library Congress. I got up at 3:30. I started writing a letter to my son. I said, I'm in the land of the blood quantum. I said, because we'd had this discussion with my kids before. I said, if they bring in blood quantum into our country, you two are going to fail, because that's just probably the reality of it. I hope it never does happen. But yesterday we went to the Smithsonian Institute, and I was devastated. I'd tried to prepare myself, because in Vancouver I went to the First Nations museum there, and I saw those beautiful facades of those magnificent houses, the art, which is so beautiful, so moving. And I just sat down in a corner, and I thought, how could you possibly look at that art, look at those houses, and call those people savages? And yesterday I thought I'd tied myself up pretty well, and I got in there to the Smithsonian, and there is a photograph of 40,000 buffalo skulls. And the purpose of that, as written in the literature, as displayed there, was if we can't kill all the Indian people, we can at least kill their food. And going around through the Smithsonian, I saw continuous references to the church being involved, being party to these decisions. Not people of massive ill will, but people with a huge opinion of their own culture and religion, as opposed to what, if you look at the Smithsonian, was a perfectly valid culture. Pueblo village there, beautiful photograph of it. Vast village, beautifully architecturally built, and yet those people were dispossessed as savages. Hard to believe. And last night we went into the beautiful Library of Congress, one of the best libraries in the world, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. I met the deputy editor of the Washington Post, one of the best newspapers in the world, and she didn't come to see me. I found that hard to believe. She came because she loved the building. But I was still back in the Smithsonian, and this fella here said, as we're going in, it's amazing what slavery can build, isn't it? And it's true that all of that is built on the bones of the Indian nation and the bones of buffalo. This book, Dark Emu, I'm trying to redress the history of the country, because we've been called hunters and gatherers. And, all of our archaeologists, all of our historians bend themselves in two trying to prove that Aboriginal people did not have possession of the soil, did not use it. And in fact, the explorers, who were all English, saw a completely different economy of the Aboriginal land. They saw people harvesting grain over an area of 9 miles. The grain was not only cut, but it was stooped. The people in Major Mitchell's party who saw this said it looked like an English village. This is not hunting and gathering. The book talks about numerous examples of it. Some of them are very, very, very dramatic, but my aim was to show that we weren't hunters and gatherers. I don't care what the label is, but it wasn't hunting and gathering. And our people had a viable culture which was intricately devoted to the land, because we mentioned it in the panel before about women being central to our culture. And in most Aboriginal cultures, we refer to everything being through the mother. We touch the ground is the mother, through the mother. It comes up all the time. And we are devoted to the land, not the other way around. We don't own it. We come from it. And we have to protect it. And that's what the book is trying to do. And when I first went to publish this book, I had a group of professors from our national capital, Canberra. They invited me to a special meeting. They all had the leather patches on their elbows to prove that they were real academics. They tried to smoke pipes. And they said, we're really disturbed by this manuscript because you've mentioned agriculture in the same sentence as the word Aborigine. It didn't happen. And I went out after that and I bought the first explorer's journal I could find, and in it I read that passage about Thomas Mitchell riding through 9 miles of cut grain, and I then said to myself, I have got the book. Not out of my own genius, which is quite substantial, but I have got the book. It has been given to me. It came to me. It was delivered. And I was so pleased to find that evidence that white academics could not refute because it had been written by other white academics. If you call the explorers academics, because they were probably the best educated people in the land at the time. So this is a defence of Aboriginal life, the Aboriginal economy, the Aboriginal spirit, and hopefully, you know, in years to come, we won't have to do this kind of stuff. We'll be able to tell more important stories about our people. But at the moment, we seem to be in a defence. Sorry?
We'll be dead.
Well, thanks for cheering me up again. Yeah, I'm superbly conscious of that. So.
He's trying to make sure that our stories survive that. And I just, the title of your book with the dark emu, and this is something that academics and other people in Australia are starting to realise, and you know, it's the same. I was laughing in the news a couple of months ago. It said the next big superfoods will be Indigenous foods of Australia. And we went, oh, geez, they told us before that was crap, you know, and now they want us to eat it. And then I started looking at what the so-called superfoods in the world were. And quinoa, where does it come from? You know, and so you start to think about, is the world turning? Are you starting to realise that that Indigenous peoples, native peoples, they had, this is that hidden history, the secret history, they had answers to things. And, you know, Tony said earlier that, you know, we need to look towards Indigenous people and their histories and how they survived, because in Australia we survived through ice ages, megafauna, and that will lead us into our next speaker, who is actually her next book. You might want to tell us a little bit about what you're writing about.
I'll talk briefly about the book because it's sort of, you know, you kind of feel a little bit guilty sometimes when you haven't been working on something, but you know, we've been having fun here as well. Definitely not much time for writing, but yeah, my next novel is going to be about the creatures, the animals that used to inhabit Australia during the period where Aboriginal people lived together with these, you know, you think of kangaroos and wombats and all the Australian animals that you may know, that there once was way bigger versions of these animals. And yeah, I'm really interested in those stories and how the nation has held these stories of these animals through song and dance and art and stories, and yeah, I'm really excited about this next book, which has the tentative title of Days of Extinction. And my uncle, he told me that our neighbours, the Bundjalung people who we're entwined with, were the happiest people in the world, you know, scientifically proven that they were, because of Bundjalung country being so rich and biodiverse that, you know, there was a lot of, didn't have to work many hours of the day. There was a lot of time for art, for family life, for culture. That was a really big part of everyday life, and that's something that's a value that I choose to live by and encourage other people and myself, and you know, to make time for culture, for art, and writing is now a part of that. And you know, he's also told me about the biggest gathering in, you know, the southeast coast, southeast Queensland, was the Bunya Festival, which is about 4 hours west of Brisbane is the Bunya Mountains, which, you know, there's still a lot of bunya trees that remain there, a big population there, but a lot of have been cut in you know, a lot have been, and there's not many around anymore in surrounding areas, and people from all over the place used to meet at this location, and that they were our conferences, you know, that was how we passed on information, and really had this multi-nation approach to land and you know, land management, how looking after the land will you know, increase the rainfall in another area, you know, how everything is connected. And so, you know, these teachings that I'm learning, as I mentioned before, are contradictory to my learnings at school, and this is, if I have some time, I would like to read from a passage that talks to that, about how young people, you know, even today are growing up so confused by this two-world thing that Janine mentioned.
While you're getting that ready, I'll just tell people about the bunya nut. It's
sorry, it's a superfood.
Yeah.
So
I wasn't going to say that.
No, we're not going to say that. Don't take our bunya nuts. You talk.
But while you're getting your book together, the bunya nut only comes out every 4 years.
Yeah.
And the festival that Ellen is talking about, it was like an Olympic Games. It only ever happened every 4 years, and the tribes would come from all over, including my own, which now is in another state after the borders were put in. But we would come over, and it was big. When the food was in abundance, that's when people met, and we would exchange everything from ideas to tools. You know, they found pearl shells from Broome down at these festivals, because we had trade routes all across Australia. Were moving, but and we would, you know, there would be competitions, the best dancer, running exercises, wives. You might have found a new wife there. You know, there's all sorts of things that happen, but these festivals were quite important. So,
also,
you know, it's like the Olympic Games.
Also, you know, my uncle's told me a little bit about it, but you know, it's men's business. I'm sure you guys understand. We have women's business and men's business, but initiation was to climb up to the top of the tree and to bring the bunya nuts down, and they used, you know, they made holes in the tree, footholes and armholes, and you see now that it's pretty amazing if you go to the Bunya Mountains to see how the trees have grown, and how these footholes now, you know, so far, you know, this far apart. It's pretty cool. We've been here for a long time. So this is a reading from the book. 13 is the age that makes you. I lived in the Hill End Road house with my mother and grandmother. When I complained about no electricity or that the toilet was outdoors, my grandmother said, "Colin, look," pointing to the grasslands that surrounded our property and the mountain they held. "You are living and breathing on country. This makes you my very special grandson. When dinner had been prepared and I'd eaten with my usual ferocity, I would sit eagerly by my grandmother's side and wait for her yarning time. Even when I could barely keep my eyes open, I put my head to the floorboards and listened. As the only child in the house, I liked when my cousin Amy came to visit with my uncle, and we would nick the bikes at the car shop on the corner and race through the flats. The bikes never had much fuel, so we know we could only go so far. Our perimeter was in most times empty creek bed. I knew we were both itching to go further, knowing that when we got home, Amy would have to go before dusk back to the city, and I'd be thinking about school the next day. School and the other kids was still something I was negotiating. My father had come from Ireland, so it wasn't very dark. When I passionately shared a few of the stories my grandmother told me, the other kids called me half-caste. It didn't really stop me though. I even spoke up in English class because the teacher was talking like we weren't even here before. And I got kicked out, but I had the whole oval to myself until lunchtime. I made a nest out of the twigs. I was the sort of kid who couldn't stop touching the earth, sculpting it with my hands. And that was when I saw Mia. She was beautifully brown. Her face was brown, her arms were brown, and her legs were brown. She was walking with her adopted mother. They'd come through the gate at the bottom of the oval. I gathered up my bottle caps and put them in my pockets of my shorts and scrambled over the banks and followed them. I knew I should have made myself known and helped them find their way, but I straight away felt shame I wasn't in class. Class Mia was dressed all pretty too, shiny black shoes and white socks, 2 flash drawers like Murray's here. They disappeared into the school office. After lunch, I saw that she was in my class and I rushed home and told grandmother, "There's another black kid in my class, a girl." Grandmother said, "Go easy. I have to check if we're related first."
That's great. We said earlier in the one of the previous sessions that family is core to Aboriginal lives, and that as kids you have the competition of who's got the most cousins, and is that my cousin? Oh, is he my cousin? And you walk around, and so we've always got to be checking, and because of the stolen generation and people having to move, lots of people moving into cities for all different opportunities, educational, we have sometimes might not know, and we have to be told, hang on, that person may be your cousin, you can't marry. I was just going to finish up on, there's a lot of the situation in Australia with Aboriginal people is often, it's still not great, although we are now taking it on ourselves to tell our stories and to come out and say, this is what we want, this is what we like. But currently we still have higher mortality rates, 10 years less than other Australians. And you lot might want to add to this. We have the highest incarceration rates of any race of people in the world. We have a large suicide rate amongst our youth particularly, and we have a phenomena called cluster suicides, where it's not just one, it's several. And it happens to be mostly boys, young boys. Can someone tell me any other stats, a couple more?
Good ones or?
Good ones?
Yeah.
No, just give me some bad, because I'm going to end on a good one.
Well, it was in fact that this morning in the one of the Australian papers I looked at online, the suicide rate is about 30 times higher than anyone else. Where it clusters the other way in the sense of where the only Aboriginal communities where those statistics drop are communities that we talked about it before, communities with a very strong role or a dominant role of women in the community. dry communities, generally dry communities, and communities that get access to what other Australians would take for granted. So, talking about Bruce's work, and I'm working on climate change academically, one of the interesting statistics there is that when Aboriginal people's knowledge is actually given proper credibility and authority, the impact on that on young Aboriginal people to give people a sense of purpose is enormously strong. And in communities where Aboriginal people are pushed to the margins, and Alan's talking about hiding stories of that we grew up with. If you grew up as an Aboriginal kid in a community where the dominant story is that not only does what you know in your family not have any weight, or in the sense that they don't exist, that itself can lead to depression, mental illness, and suicide. There's a wonderful Australian filmmaker called Ivan Sen who made a wonderful feature called Beneath Clouds. And there is the most telling moment in this feature film, if you can ever see it, where Vaughan, who was an Aboriginal boy who's escaped from an institution, a jail, he tells another Aboriginal young woman about a cliff top where all the Aboriginal people were pushed off by the farmers. And he says, now nobody gives a shit. But what's interesting, the next thing he says is, he said, my mum left me because she knew she was going to have a criminal for her son. And it's not coincidental that once he tells the story of the denial of what happened to Aboriginal people, his next comment is about his own having no self-worth. So when you don't allow people to tell their stories, you lose your self-worth. Bernhard Schlink, the German writer who wrote The Reader, in a great lecture of his, said that we owe it to the people who have had their story taken from them the dignity to return it and let them tell their own story. And if you don't let Aboriginal people, or people who have Native American people, whatever, you are in fact denying people a basic human right, and that has a shocking effect on people.
Yeah, and just to finish up, we want to, that we have contributed to Australian society, and it's probably not acknowledged as much. I mean, we're not just the best sports people in Australia, but apart from that, that we have contributed in many other ways. And one of the examples I want to give you is that Australia is a country that has fairly damaging bushfires. When Aboriginal people for thousands of years would do what they call backburning, you would burn the dry vegetation at the bottom. And when we were all, that was always laughed at. Why are they doing it? And now they've realised that that's the way you stop the damage and the bushfires. So our knowledge, people are starting to accept our knowledge. But even though there's always, there's still those high statistics, I want to just end on something quite incredible. That in 2006, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we do the census every so often. They give you all these, statistics that could make you cry about Aboriginal people, but there was one that really struck me. 70% of Aboriginal people said they are happy. On that, I'd like to thank you for coming.
Sorry, Kathy, I'd just like to
remind
people that there was one other great Australian Aboriginal invention, which was the oil can. And I'm surprised it hasn't been imported into America, because otherwise this door behind me would stop squeaking.
You had me going for a while. I'm thinking, oil can? So we're open to questions, and thank you for coming. Any? Are you asking a question? You should know. Oh.
Did anybody define what an Aboriginal is in Australia, what an Australian Aboriginal person is? Because Bruce mentioned quotients, and so many people have asked me, did we give our definition? That's all I'm going to say. Because
I think after the session you left the room, we talked a little bit about the diversity, and that Aboriginal people are all different. We've all got different histories. And Bruce talked about the quantum, because we know that here in America they're still using that, for instance. And it's a big debate. In Australia, we don't believe that people are measured on blood because of our histories. We believe that if you strongly identify and you have those links, that should be the way that's why we all look different. But maybe one of you want to comment on that?
We also recognise 2 Indigenous groups in Australia, also the Torres Strait Islanders, who are at the top of Australia. And Queensland has both. We're proud to have both groups, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander
They're a different racial
people.
group. They're Melanesian, and they're more their associations are more with Papua New Guinea and places like that. But they are part of our country too.
Yeah.
And I suppose the only thing I'd add, and again with Lee, we were talking today, people in Australia find this hard to believe, let alone outside Australia. I come from the state of Victoria, which instituted the first caste legislation in the Commonwealth in 1886 called the Half Caste Act. We've defined categories of quarter caste, half caste, octoroon, etc. But as I was saying to Lee today, the ambiguous nature of Aboriginal identity in Australia is not from within the Aboriginal community, it's within government. From that first act that defined Aboriginal identity, various Australian governments, state and federal, have instituted 80 different categories of Aboriginal identity, and they were instituted for political advantage, social disadvantage, etc. So any time a government was dissatisfied with the way it had identified Aboriginal people, it would change the legislation to suit its current political, social and economic agenda. So if you're an Aboriginal person born in New South Wales in the year 1900, and if you died in 1960, which would make you a very old Aboriginal person, your status, your legal status of identity would have changed 8 times during your lifetime.
Yep. So that's any other questions?
Is it okay to ask
Yes.
on the microphone? Okay. So 2 questions or so. Like, do Aboriginal people or people who have part Aboriginal and part other countries, other continents, do they, when they move to another place after being born in Australia, do they face the same problems? And the second question is, when they come back to visit their relatives, are they treated, fairly when they come through?
Are you talking about what we call the stolen generation?
Well, I'm
where
talking about
children were removed, and we've found children in the Netherlands, we've found children over here in the Americas. They were moved all over the world.
Well,
And we have had people coming home trying to find their families, but it's very hard for them because some of them didn't even speak English. They were raised speaking other languages.
I wasn't only thinking of that. That was part of what I was thinking of, but also currently, how is the situation? What country treats them the best when they move to that country? And so,
I'm
you can
not
answer
quite
that. Thank you.
sure what
Thank
that
you.
means. You're talking about Aboriginal countries. We accept people. If we know that you've got a relation, then you're accepted. If there's a bloodline there and that you're accepted in the community. I think we've tried not to take the way that's happened to Native Americans. We've tried to say that you're Aboriginal if you are Aboriginal and that you have that bloodline.
Unless you follow Bruce's football team, if you're an Aboriginal person and you follow Richmond Football Club, it's very hard to get accepted into any community in Australia.
No. Any other questions? That's it? Thank you. Oh, one, sorry.
Are your work and your stories and your issues, getting heard and getting an audience in the United States and in other places?
This is our first big trip. Individually, we've come over at different times, and we've worked with, a lot of our writers and artists. In fact, we've got 30 performing artists in Vancouver at the moment. So we do come quite a lot. But, it's I guess it's the biggest part for us is that it's outside of Australia that people actually probably are more interested and informed. Within Australia, it's sometimes harder. The younger generation are a lot different, but, my mum used to say you have to wait for the old white men to die before we could move on. And, all the governments and that, it's probably like a lot of Western countries, it's a family trade in politics, and so often it's the same family that runs through. This country is a great example of that.
And we are trying to, broaden our readership, and we're starting this afternoon because there's a bookshop downstairs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.